So we're wrapping up the Ivor Miller discussion of his article, Creolization for Survival in the City. In the last 10 pages or so of his article, you see lots of interviews with a lot of artists, with a lot of writers. And I think there are a few key issues that for me stand out in this last section. First off, we find that Miller is trying to do some analysis of this art. What is this art like? Why does it have the features that it has? And so he's going to look to African American cultural influences. In particular, he's going to look at music, motion, rhythm, color, and he sees a lot of the influence from African American themes in the shapes of the letters, for example, in graffiti, the shapes of human figures. So both in the human figures and the letters, he sees this. Keep in mind that the canvas for these artists is always moving. And so even when the trains are still, the letters also look like they're in motion. So there's an interesting element there. He also talks about colors that are inspired by African American culture. And so he looks to textiles in African American cultures, the traditional kente cloth, quilt making. And he says if you look at kente cloth, if you look at quilt making, you'll see that these beautiful colors, sort of these vivid oranges and greens and golds and browns that you see in kente cloth, and then the way that the shapes of the quilts are designed. If any of you do quilting, you know that you can actually see motion sometimes in the design. It can fool the eye and you'll see motion. So he sees in quilt making and kente cloth the same motion and colors and even rhythm to the art, rhythm to the designs. He also sees examples, influences from popular culture. And we already talked about popular culture in comic books. We've already talked about popular culture in advertising, mainstream advertising that took off during the 60s and 70s in the US. But he says also take a look at the new science fiction trends, certainly on television, which was also a big influence. We have more science fiction there, but also in film. Remember that in the 70s you get Star Wars begins, that George Lucas trilogy starts, comes out in 1977. So you get a lot of interest in science fiction, you get a lot of interest in superheroes that are coming to the big screen, Superman, etc. You get a lot of interest in comic book figures. And that, he says, you see that particularly in some of the self-portraits that some of these writers do in their art. Also, in popular culture at this time, there was a tendency, particularly, throughout the country actually, in a variety of ethnic groups, a tendency to try to find our history, to find our culture. There was a renewed interest in identity, identifying ourselves with the past. So you'll see images from ancient African culture in some of these artists' work. You'll see images from Egypt. For those artists who are inspired by Caribbean themes because their culture is from the Caribbean, you'll see images associated with Taino culture. That's T-A-I-N-O, Taino culture. These are the indigenous people whom Columbus first identified when he came to this part of the world. So lots of interesting influences, Miller says, from ancient history, whether it's the ancient Caribbean or ancient Africa or other places. So some very interesting elements in color, music, rhythm, interesting themes coming from ancient Egypt, from the ancient Caribbean. And so all of these things coming in to create, again, this new art form that has a lot to do with the way that the artists themselves perceive themselves in this society, in this 1970s, 1980s New York City environment. Also, there is the element of the civil rights movement, right? And these artists will convey to Miller that they might not have saw themselves as political, they might not have saw themselves as part of some kind of movement, but they knew that this movement was all around them, that it was going around all the time. If you take a look on page 176, you'll see Coco 144 talking about his perceptions about how social change had something to do with his identity. He says in there, and I'm just paraphrasing, that if you were Latino, if you were Puerto Rican, if you were black, people thought you were going to be a certain person in life. If you were Dominican, you were going to be a doorman. If you were black, you would be someone who shined shoes. And he said, you know, that's not who I am. Just because I come from a particular ethnic background, that doesn't mean I'm going to be this profession or this person. And he found that expressing himself through art, through graffiti, was a better way of saying who he was versus the kind of profession that people from his neighborhood typically went into, right? So you also have that idea of the civil rights movement coming in on this. So again, Miller is talking about this artistic movement, this social movement reflecting cultural identity in New York. That identity is in and of itself a city identity, an urban identity in one of the biggest cities in this country for sure, but in the world. The art is fast. The art is dangerous. It's art in motion. It reflects culture. It reflects developments in music, advertising, entertainment, television, comic books. And what's interesting to Miller is that the popularity of it goes beyond the community that created it. So the community that creates it, perhaps in the beginning, just inspired by the tools that they had at hand. Spray paint, trains, whatever you want to say, other kinds of buildings around them in an urban setting, that they realized they could communicate with each other, and then beyond that, it turned into some kind of art, some kind of artistic movement, such that you start to see museums eventually, and not too far off, starting to get interested in this art form. We even have examples, Miller talks about home decor, that some of these writers were just blown away that interior designers would come to them and say, hey, could you paint a wall for me in the living room? I need it to be 15 by 15, and I'm thinking I want to have red in it. So that was one of the issues there. So museums, home decor, advertising, jewelry design. I'm going to stop right here.